Okay. Hey, hey, hey. It is Rebecca Simon Peter coming to you with Leadership Mojo today. Our work is all about transforming church leaders and the congregations that you serve. And this Leadership Mojo is really designed to support and empower you and help you deal with the issues of the day. So, one of the things that we've been talking about recently is gun violence and the role of the church in gun violence. And man, this is so tough. I mean, since I even wrote this blog, there was another shooting, and one more once safe space has now been punctured by the violence of guns, and that's the Fourth of July parade in the suburbs of Chicago. And we're really going to get at some of what promotes and promulgates all of this violence, and that is the culture of hate and violence. We've got a whole culture that really focuses on that. So our topic today is disarming the culture of hate and violence. And I'm really grateful to be joined in this discussion by kind of an expert in the field of detoxifying, and when churches are really when toxic culture, toxic belief, toxic practice comes to the church, what do you do about that? So let me introduce to you my colleague, Derek Kubelis, the vicar, Derek Kubelis, who pastors in Ohio. And Derek, please introduce yourself to us and tell us about where you serve.
I am an elder in the United Methodist Church. I'm glad to be here, by the way, Rebecca.
Glad to have you. Yeah.
I'm an elder in the United Methodist Church. I serve the East Ohio Conference. I've actually just started my new appointment this past Sunday at the First United Methodist Church of Ashland,
Okay.
near Ashland Seminary in Northeast Ohio.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, welcome. Welcome very much to Leadership Mojo. So, Derek, I've been talking with folks over the last several weeks about some of the factors that contribute to gun violence. And so one of them is clearly the deflection of personal responsibility. And a lot of times we think, well, that's out there, Washington, they're supposed to do something. But we're really bringing it home because in creating a culture of renewal, the program that I lead, we always look at how solutions can begin with us. So deflection of personal responsibility, we've looked at untreated mental health issues. We talked about sort of the lack of wellness in our culture, lax gun policies, easy access to firearms. But I think something that's really critical is the whole waters we swim in, this culture of hate and violence. And, you really inspired me, Derek, and we didn't even know each other at the time, but you really inspired me when I wrote this recent book, Forging a New Path, because I saw that you're somebody that's really put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and put into practice some actual practices for disarming a culture that divides people and that polarizes people. So tell us a little bit about the work that you've done and what you've learned from it.
Well, I started to get very, very concerned about the kind of polarization that we're seeing in our culture right during January 6th. As a matter of fact,
Yeah.
I remember I've been concerned about it for a long time, but there was something about seeing QAnon flags, Confederate flags, nooses, all marching into the Capitol behind Christian flags and crosses and those kinds of things that made me say, "Whoa, this is going on to a new level," and it's something that I think that we all have to take seriously. I can't think of a community that wouldn't need to start addressing some of these issues within their own congregation. So I started a podcast about confronting some of the lies of the conspiracy theories that are just coursing through our society right now. And the podcast attempts to sort of confront the instinct toward conspiracy and political polarization from a Christian perspective.
Hmm.
And it tries to look at those things through sort of gospel tinted sunglasses,
Okay.
in the hopes that casts those things in a new light, right?
Hmm.
Because I think sometimes what happens is we get so wrapped up in the politics um, of our culture, and we become so sort of enthralled with it that we lose sight of our identity as Christians. We
Hmm.
start we start focusing on our identity as Republicans and Democrats,
Yeah.
focusing on our identity as sort of voters or activists or any of these things, and our identity as Christians kind of gets left behind somewhere. So I've really tried hard to bring that Christian identity back to the forefront.
Boy, Derek, first off, I got to say congratulations for being somebody who didn't deflect personal responsibility. You saw those flags, you saw those crazy icons, and you said, wait a second, somebody got to do something about this. And it turned out to be you, which is awesome. And secondly, that either or that represents Democrat, Republican, where's Christian in all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sense in which that political struggle has become the life defining struggle
Yeah.
of so many in our culture.
Yeah.
It is the grand narrative that most people see their lives playing out against. I think the church has a different story to tell,
Mhm.
that the narrative that defines our lives, even here and now, is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, right? And everything else is important. But ultimately, uh, it's just a blip on the radar screen of that grand story.
Mhm.
And that story needs to be shaping how we think about the smaller political stories of our lives.
That's so interesting. The smaller political stories of our lives. Yeah, I'm sure that some people are like, what? Because it's not a small story for them. But you're right, it's a sub identity for those who identify in the faith tradition defined by Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
the difficult thing is that we continue to expose ourselves to media who that exists for the purpose of capturing our attention
Right.
away from that better story and focusing it on the smaller story. And the smaller story is important, right?
Yeah.
The defeat of Roe versus Wade is an important story. The
Yeah.
January 6th insurrection is an important story. Uh, those things are important, but for us, we have to put them in the context of
Yeah.
the greater redemption and the greater victory that's already been won.
And the greater call too, right? Of what we're called in the United Methodist tradition, we're called to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Like, so, yeah, we
Absolutely.
do have a context through which to understand the events that are happening around us. And then I
Mm,
would add too, there's the beloved community. There's the kingdom of God.
mm,
Jesus' life, death, and resurrection ultimately pointing to, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it
yeah.
is in heaven. So, yeah.
Yeah, ultimately, building that alternative community, whereas the rest of the world um, is kind of based in that ethic of scarcity. Um, the church, can exist as a community of abundance.
Hmm.
And we can do that in a way that the secular political kingdoms of this world could never hope to, right?
Yeah, right. It's all about taxes and tax breaks. Derek, tell us, you have such a wealth of experience and information, and you've you've really begun to hone the art of motivational interviewing to help kind of tease out toxicity by acknowledging people and where they're coming from. Tell us about those 3 questions related to motivational interviewing, and what's the purpose of those questions?
Well, ultimately, you have to connect with people and their story, right?
Okay.
Um, so often when we experience conflict, whether it comes from um, somebody who thinks has a differing political opinion than we do, or someone who comes from a different class, or someone who comes from a different kind of identity, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Our first instinct is to try to educate that person.
Right.
Um,
Here's why you're wrong.
yeah, just to kind of set them straight.
Yeah.
And we live in a world where that no longer produces results, right? If everyone is trying to teach everyone else,
Yeah.
then nobody learns.
Ah. Hmm.
So, what I recommend doing is um, put yourself in the spot of the learner for a second.
Mm.
And that can sound really offensive to folks who are really ideologically driven. But when
Mhm.
you're Christ driven and you care about relationships and you care about soul work, it's a
Mm.
lot easier to do, right?
Mm.
So you put yourself in the position of the learner and you say, hey, you have this belief that is different than what I believe and that
Mm.
frankly I find offensive.
Mm.
Can you tell me about it?
Mm.
Can you tell me about how you came to have this belief? What are the experiences that you yourself had that led to this?
Mm.
Um, and in so doing, you're not just arguing with that person, but you're trying to form a connection with them. You are empathizing with who they are, and you are respecting their story, right?
Mm.
Um, I've talked to people before about gun violence,
Mm.
and um, some folks that have some pretty extreme views on gun ownership, who don't want to see any regulation whatsoever, right? Zero regulation, essentially. What I would consider to be extreme. And um, you talk to those people, and they start to tell you their story, and you find out that there was a very special rifle, right,
Mm.
that was passed down from father to son to son to son, so on and so forth, and that they exist in a tradition of gun owners, right?
Yeah.
And they feel that that tradition and that culture, which initially started as a hunting culture, as an outdoors sort of
Yeah.
sporting culture, they feel that culture is under attack.
Mhm.
And until you acknowledge that culture, until you pay respect to it,
Mm.
they're not going to listen to anything that you say,
Mhm.
because you just want to take their gun away.
Mhm. Boy, that's so interesting. And so tell me the different kinds of folks you've engaged with the motivational interviewing, and what have the effects been on the life of the church or the life of the community as you've come with curiosity rather than teaching?
Yeah, that's a good question. Even coming at it from this method will still produce blowback from time to time, right?
Mhm.
Especially because so much of my work in the area is done around conspiracy theories. In
Okay.
particular, the QAnon conspiracy theory that has kind of taken hold, especially in Christian cultures, unfortunately. There are churches, there are pastors that promote the QAnon conspiracy even to this day.
Wow.
Um, and some of those folks are in a position of such incredible defensiveness because they're trained by the theory to be in that. And so if you even start talking about it, they will kind of sniff that out and get very agitated and get very upset. So what I try to do is I try to form a connection outside of that topic. You know, I try to find what else we have in common. What are the other places of common ground that we share? And then you can start building trust. And that personal one-on-one trust is what you have to have in order to be able to have a dialogue where you can speak truth into one another's lives, right?
Have you gotten to that point, Eric, where you could speak truth into
Oh,
another?
absolutely.
You have.
Absolutely. The I can't say too much about individual stories, obviously, because those belong to those people. But I think when you take the time, not just okay, if everyone's willing to take the time to promote their own pet ideology, right? Everyone's willing to take the time to promote their politics, to promote their team. When you take the time to connect with a person and you make it clear that you want that connection regardless of their stance on an issue, that you want that relationship with them in in the deepest possible way, and it doesn't matter how they form their political identity. You want a relationship with the identity that's deeper than that. And if you spend the time and the energy in the relational capital to get that, then lives can change. Lives really can change.
That's so beautiful. You know, it's really miraculous in a way because we've gotten to a place where we don't talk to each other. We don't listen to each other. We defend ourselves. We don't want to talk to people that are going to poke at us or belittle or disbelieve.
Yeah.
And you're really talking about a simple yet profound miracle of connection and listening. And that's really near and dear to my heart. And when we talk about disarming a culture of hate and violence, there are these questions, this motivational interviewing process, which draws people out and dignifies them and gets at deeper stories than political identities, say. What other what else would you say to leaders, church leaders, that are looking to disarm the culture of hate and violence? What would you suggest to them?
I think the precursor to the culture of hate and violence is the culture of sarcasm and making fun of our ideological opponents, particularly on social media, right?
Yeah.
And I actually preach a lot about sort of how to conduct yourself on social media.
Well, that's great.
And these are older people I'm talking to, younger people, it doesn't matter. I make it very clear that sharing the political meme that intends to be cutting that intends to make fun of one's opponent, all of those things um, can only contributes to the polarization that you're seeing.
Mm.
And so
Huh.
one of the things that I tell my congregations, particularly around election season,
Mhm.
is okay, I know you want to post on social media about this election. And that's fine. That's a good impulse, right? You want to take part in the civil discourse. I just don't use memes, don't use sarcasm, don't use short, pithy little posts. If you want to say something about an issue politically on social media, take time and compose your words.
Mm.
Use a lot of words. um, uh, and treat it seriously.
Yeah.
Um, because it takes 2 seconds to tweet a hurtful thing
Yeah.
or post
Yeah.
some sarcastic thing on Facebook that really starts to soil a real relationship in the real world.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. That's really great. You're the first pastor I've heard that preaches on how to post on social media. That's really
It's
great.
so important. I mean,
It
if we're gonna, it's such a huge part of the way we communicate with one another in our
it
culture.
is. Yeah.
And the same way we would teach people in a congregation about how to um, talk to their loved ones about any difficult issue.
Hmm.
We need to talk about how to engage with one another. Um, he who says you fool, right, will be liable to the fires of Gehenna.
Yeah.
So uh, I think we should take that seriously. I really
Really
do.
great. Yeah, it's really great, Derek. Well, you're full of, just really helpful practices that I think many pastors can learn from and many church leaders can learn from. And I really appreciate your being here today to talk with us about, how you can actually disarm that culture. So, what I'm hearing is number one, don't shy away from the topic of engaging your people in how they're engaging the world, whether it's politically, on social media, the kinds of words that we use with each other, and also don't be afraid to really go deep with somebody,
Mm,
even if their point of view is reprehensible to you, to not
hmm
get stopped there, but to find out who they are as a person. What's their story? How did they wind up where they are? Which I think is great. As a person coming out of a Jewish background, born and raised Jewish, had an experience of Jesus when I was 28, which changed my whole life.
mm,
My story is everything. Not like it's got to be front and center, but if you want to understand me, you got to understand where I come from. Otherwise,
absolutely.
my beliefs and my thoughts and my attitudes and which holidays I celebrate won't make any sense to you. Like,
Mhm.
why are you celebrating Hanukkah? Well, let me tell you, it won't make any sense. So we do need to understand each other's stories. And I so appreciate that very humane way that you have of approaching people. Derek, I wish there were a ton of pastors out there like you. And, you're doing really, really good work. What's one last thing that you would encourage our listeners with as they think about disarming the culture of hate and violence?
Um, I think you have to have the courage to love and get close to those who are different than you.
Mm,
Don't get close to those who are actively hurting you,
mhm,
um, but get close to those whose opinions, whose ideologies, whose cultures
mm,
make you uncomfortable, and take
mm,
the position of a learner.
Boy, there's a great challenge right there. Get around people, make you uncomfortable, take the position of a learner. It's very humble. It's very beautiful. It's very Christ-like. And Derek, thank you so much for sharing with us. And if people want to tune into your worship services, are you folks online?
Yeah, First Ashland, First United Methodist Church of Ashland, Ohio.
Mhm.
Um, if you my QAnon podcast, I'm not posting new episodes anymore. But the old ones are still on there. It's called Crossover Q. You can just Google that and you'll find it.
Very good. You have some really great resources to offer people, and I hope they will take advantage of them. So thanks again, Derek, for
Great.
being here today.
Thank
Been
you
great.
for the opportunity.
Yeah, you're most welcome. All right. Well, what a great conversation today with Reverend Derek Kubelis, vicar at his church. And thank you for joining me today. It's been really good to talk about and dive into how do church leaders deal with gun violence? What is the role of the church? What can it be? And I want to offer a couple of follow-up resources. So the first is Forging a New Path, moving the church forward in a post-pandemic world. And you can get copies on Amazon, et cetera. But I'm really writing about how do we move the church forward in a post-pandemic world? You know, we've got the war in Ukraine, we've got, craziness with gun violence, but how do we move forward? What is the role of the church in all of this? And I think that's really important for us, not to give up on the church, not to give up on Christ, not to give up on community. And if you really want to go deep or you're still questioning how you can create spiritual community in your setting, I want to invite you to check out Creating a Culture of Renewal. We have cohorts starting this fall, and really helps you develop your congregational intelligence, your leadership smarts, and your ability to shift the culture. So thanks again for joining me today. And if you found this helpful, I invite you to share it, to like it, so that you can get references about upcoming Facebook Lives. And next week, we're going to be talking about gun policies, what you can do in the home and the church, what you can do in your community, how you personally can help shape sane gun policies that protect rights and keep people safe. Thank you so much for joining me here on Leadership Mojo. This is Rebecca Simon Peter. We'll see you next time. Thanks.